Father Sean here, and today I'm going to talk about vaccines. I'm addressing this because someone came up to me and said, Father Sean, sometimes you do a talk, I got a podcast, and they say, I am looking for a specific thing. I am needing some just backbone information on the vaccine situation because it's just confusing. I don't know exactly who to listen to, who to trust, all this kind of stuff. So in response to that request, I thank Amy for that, I will address this in two parts. First off, this episode today, which will be on Facebook, maybe I might put it on YouTube just to put it on Facebook, and then also on my podcast, better known as not my podcast, but Father Sean's podcast. I'll put it up, and it will address vaccines in general, and then vaccines specifically regarding vaccination against COVID-19. So that will be part one, and I will address that today. Part two will address the complicating factors of how the heck can I get good information? Because that's a legitimate thing, and that affects kind of our moral decision making because we have to have a sense of the situation in order to make a decision, but it's hard to get a sense of the situation. We kind of lack a readily accessible source for that unadulterated information. And that affects a lot more things than vaccines. So I will address this as a general, national, probably an international problem. Just how to come up with ways where we can make sure our mind is nourished by what is good, true, and beautiful for the glory of God. Today, part one, we're looking at the vaccines. Let's begin with a prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, give us the gift of counsel so that we may discern the truth and what to do. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Let's dive on in here. So I kind of have a bioethic background. I studied moral theology with a focus on bioethics after I completed my seminary studies. And so I'm not going to be giving you my theological opinions on this stuff. And if I do, I think there's one point where I might. But I will be addressing this from the church's teaching. I'm not going to kind of mix it up with my own personal thoughts. I'm not a very big thinker. I don't have a lot of thoughts on this. My thought is informed by the church, and that's what I'm trying to keep it as. And I'm not going to really include a ton of scientific material here. I'm not a scientist. That is not my job. That's not my expertise. And I will admit that once everything kind of hit the United States in March, I was doing everything I could to kind of keep abreast of the latest and greatest information. And I kind of found my sources that I could trust, and I kind of watched them and listened to them and try to absorb the material. And I kept doing that. I think it was all the way to some point in November, it might have been early December, when I was reading from St. Paul, and he was saying that his job was to know nothing but Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I realized, for someone who's not in the medical field and who's a priest, well, I need to be knowing nothing other than Jesus Christ and him crucified, and how that relates to our daily living. And that's where bioethics comes in. Medical ethics, as sometimes we call it. The ethics of regarding medical decisions. So today, let us dive into the topic of vaccines. Firstly, addressing what is general ethics regarding vaccines. The magisterium has not been a stranger to this theme. They've addressed it for a number of decades now. And they have said that vaccinations propose to us a good that is to be desired and very legitimate to pursue. They are something that are not mandatory. No one is saying that it is a mandatory obligation on one's conscience, one's Christian conscience, to get a vaccine. No. Actually, maybe propose that as maybe an idea or as a maybe in my article in the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic, but since then it was clear from the documents of the church, especially a recent one that came out, that is not the case for vaccines in general. No one has to get any kind of vaccine. So parents have the right to choose, adults have the right to choose. It is a good, though, the Vatican does say. And the Vatican, the church's magisterium, does say that, in fact, when it's legitimate, when it's scientifically kind of cleared to be effective and to be free of any kind of questions, moral questions, well then, in that case, yeah, it can even be a real charity for other people, an action of charity. The second question that I think is probably relevant for us here regarding the COVID-19 vaccines. I'm not addressing these specifically yet. I'm giving you the general theory behind a moral analysis for those. This is regarding the cooperation with evil regarding their involvement or lack of involvement with abortions. Not all vaccines are connected, even distantly, with abortions, but the truth is that some of them are. There are two primary cell lines. One was from the 70s and one was from the 80s that came about from research done from using the tissue that came from aborted fetuses. And so this is kind of a big part of our discussion here. There are a number of different not lenses, but criteria that we need to consider when there is a vaccine that has been developed from these cell lines. Again, these are not cell lines that have come from aborted fetuses. They are cell lines that have been coming from the cells originally, but they are no longer fetus cells, or at least the cells that came from that aborted fetus. Those cells multiplied, and these cells never belonged to a human body. But we could say the cell line does originally come from that human person as well, though, who was killed in that abortion. So the first part is we got to say no to abortion. We cannot say like, hey, this is okay, it's a good. No, we have to be very concentrated on the fact that we are not willfully cooperating in abortion. We don't want abortion. We don't like abortion. We believe that is an evil. This would be like saying a taxi driver who's saying, I want to bring people to abortion clinics. Abortion clinic, you just let me know when somebody is riding, I will be there. That is called willful cooperation because he's willing to help that person out, unless it's a girl taxi driver. But he's willing to help this person out to get an abortion. Willful cooperation, or as probably more commonly called in the world of bioethics, formal cooperation. This is always wrong in any kind of cooperation with evil. Secondly, there is the opposite of that. There's non-willful cooperation, also sometimes known as material cooperation. This would be like a taxi driver who was saying like, hey, I don't believe in abortions. I don't want to be a part of it. Someone just hopped in my car and they said, take me to the abortion clinic. I was like, hey, I'm just trying to make a living here. So they're not willing the abortion, but nonetheless, they are physically bringing this person to get the abortion. And in a very key, integral way. And this is also very clearly wrong. Because if he said, yes, it's my job, but at this day, I'm not going to accomplish my job, and I'm going to give up that money that I would have had otherwise, he would save a life. He would save a life. Like, the obligation is there to save a life when you have the opportunity to, especially when it's so easy, like in his circumstance. So even though it's non-willful cooperation, he must say no to this because it is so close, because it is so integral. Now, there's also degrees of closeness, because that was a very close relationship to non-willful cooperation with the abortion. But there's also like maybe the taxi driver came up and he stopped at a gas pump where there was an attendant there who was filling up cars with gasoline. And there he was, and he said, hey, mister, can you please top off my car? I need some gas so I can help people get to the abortion clinic. And the gas attendant would be like, well, that's strange, that's bad, that's sad. Sir, you shouldn't do that. He probably is obliged to say that. He is obliged to say that because it affects what's going on right there. And we have to oppose evil. This is part of our moral responsibility as Christians and as human beings. So this is a possible sin. I would even say probable sin, especially when the taxi driver is very clear about it up front. If he said it like after the fact, like, thanks for filling up, by the way, this helps me so I can do my job of bringing women over to the abortion clinic. And then the taxi driver would be like, oh, what did I just do? And then there's a situation of even further distance from the action of abortion. This would be like somebody who uses the taxi driver service, even though they know that this person helps out with abortions. Like, if I hop into a taxi car to do that, like, am I really supporting the abortion in any practical way? Probably not. I guess I'm keeping this guy with a job, but am I really going to keep him afloat? The answer is probably not, because I'm probably not dropping him a tip of like $1,000. I'm not going to do that. In fact, when I learned that he's going to do this, and this is what he's doing, I'm not going to tip him. And in fact, I'm going to take advantage of my freedom to choose other taxi drivers if I can at all possible do that. But in and of itself, I think it would be sufficiently distant to not only be non-willful cooperation, but also, because of the distance, now permissible to accept this very distant non-willful form of cooperation with evil. So to kind of sum up what I've said so far, for there to be cooperation with evil, it's nothing that somebody wants to do, but life is messy in this valley of tears. And until we get to heaven, we're going to be buying, pens made in the United States that have little parts made in China, and it's from a country whose human rights policy are not human rights. They deny human rights. And, yet we use so much of their product to keep their Chinese businesses afloat so that they can flourish as a country. I mean, this is just one example. Even though the pen says made in the United States because it was assembled in the United States, but all the parts are made in China. Like, the world is just messy. The world is just messy. And we have to just be clear that when there is a large distance, maybe my guilt is also minimized and eliminated, even though I can still freely choose to distance myself further. So the magisterium says regarding vaccines that have used cell lines developed or manufactured or tested from cell lines that have came from fetuses, children who've been aborted, then that is illicit, not allowed for the researchers. They're not allowed to do that because it's too close. They might be non-willing the abortion, unwillful of the abortion, but they're too close. They're too closely involved with the abortion, and it clouds the waters of their conscience, and they're not opposing evil sufficiently to have a good, clear conscience. But us who receive it, we are at such a distance that we don't have the same responsibility. So it is permissible to use such vaccines when, firstly, there's a great distance from the act of the abortion, when we are non-willful cooperators, when we are voicing our concern. We're not allowed to be silent. We have a duty to oppose evil. And then fourthly, when there is a sufficiently grave or proportionate good that this pursues. We can't just use these vaccines just to kind of have a good time on the weekend. No. It has to be something sincere. For example, the health of children, the health of aging. This is the example that the church has provided, the health of children. And I think we can assume health for anyone in general. And I think also we need to recognize that when there is a better option, we have an obligation to choose the better option. That's probably very clear. So this is the analysis of vaccines in general. And just some follow-up points here. These are voluntary. They're voluntary. But the church has also reminded us that when I am opting out of something that is good and provides provides a real help for society, then I need to make sure that I am doing what I can in order to eliminate the harmful spread of said vaccines, of said diseases, whether it be mumps, rubella, measles, all these different things. Chickenpox on the lighter end, I guess, unless you're older, I guess chickenpox are a little bit more serious for sure. Or of the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus of 2019. The church has also called such times where we have no other option but to use these vaccines that have their development compromised as acts of charity still. Because, this is also important, there is a world of social bioethics. It's not well talked about, but I have a class on it. It was super interesting. It's very real, because a lot of times the bioethics stuff relates with kind of the social order of things. I'm going to talk about this next time when I talk about the world of communications and kind of how the heck do we find some clarity there. But we are responsible for our health, not in an absolute way. Our bodies are not going to live forever. And that's kind of God's plan after the sin. He said, well, yeah, I was planning on having y'all live forever here on the earth, but it ain't going to work because y'all sinned. So we're not trying to care for our bodies in a way that they would live forever. That would be the sin of pride. But we are trying to just be good stewards of what God has given to us. Because we are social and relational beings, we also have a sincere and real duty to be mindful of other people as well. And the church has officially called us to be mindful of the health of other people, to not be negligent of that, to not cast that aside. And so as we maybe would say, I know there's a good there, I know the church has approved it, but I'm going to just not do it for whatever reason. Well, we need to do what we can still to provide for the common good, which does include the physical health of people. Not in an absolute way, but in a relational way, or in a relevant, what's the word I'm looking for there? In a real way, but it's not in an absolute way. So we have to be mindful of that. Now let's talk about vaccines specifically, regarding the vaccines of COVID-19. COVID-19. All right, so we have across the world, I guess there's some vaccines that are going around in Russia. I don't know anything about them. I'm not going to talk about them. So besides them, we have 3 vaccines that have been approved. There is the Pfizer vaccine, there's the Moderna vaccine, and there's the AstraZeneca vaccine. Pfizer and Moderna have been approved in the United States. AstraZeneca has not been approved in the United States, but it has been approved in the UK. The United States bishops have spoken very clearly on this, and it's very helpful. It's a very simple document. If you want to just Google United States bishops, statements on vaccines, coronavirus, something like that, it'll come on up. They have said that there is no available vaccine that is totally, absolutely removed from any cooperation with the evil of abortion regarding those fetuses, embryos that were aborted, one of them being in the 70s and the other being in the 80s, before I was born, kind of oddly enough. So, that is an important thing to note. They also note that COVID-19 is a serious disease. It is a serious disease. In Tulsa County, 1% of those who have been diagnosed have died of the coronavirus. So, let's not ignore that. Obviously, there's comorbidities there. There's pre-existing conditions that help that. But just to say that, well, this person would have died in 10 to 15 years anyways, that doesn't minimize the fact that they died this year. So let's not write that off too quickly. That it is a serious thing, and that people are mourning the loss of their loved ones in a way where they can't be by the bedside with them. So where they might have died of heart attack later on, or of just kind of complications of old age, well, at least the loved ones would have had the chance to be by their bedside. Well, in COVID-19, those deaths are more sad because they're alone. So it's a serious thing. And also, the most important effect of the vaccine, again, I just mentioned this, is that they're not necessarily affecting us, but they are likely to affect other people. because as I get vaccinated, then I am holding off on the spread to a loved one who might be more vulnerable. You know, we have these vaccines have shown to be very effective, 95 plus or minus percent. But that still means that of 5% of the people who get vaccinated, they're susceptible. But the good news is also that they have lighter symptoms as well. That's what the data tells me, at least, and a quick look at that. Not all demographics are affected equally. It's clear that the elderly are affected more significantly. Those with comorbidities, or I guess probably the better word is underlying conditions or pre-existing conditions, they are more vulnerable as well. We can also think of different demographics having different attitudes towards vaccines, which is very legitimate. And I will use the example of our African American brothers and sisters. I don't remember how long ago it was, but some scientists were doing experiments on syphilis and a vaccine against syphilis. And they were looking at a population of black African American Americans to perform these kind of experiments. And sadly enough, they infected these people with syphilis. And not only did they infect them with syphilis, but they didn't tell them. They did all this without their consent, which is heinous. It is wrong. And so perhaps the African American community would be more hesitant against vaccines. And I totally get that. I respect that a lot. Like, you know, please God that they are forgiving. They say, hey, look, you know what? We forgive those people. We forgive. We're striving for healing. But at the same hand, like, that's going to leave scars. And I don't want to criticize at all. Like, if I was in their shoes, I'd be like, just want to be more hesitant. Like, we got burnt on this one time. We're not going to be burnt again on this. And, like, I get that. So, you know, just a little bit more of kind of context there. So now let's look specifically at these three vaccines that are approved. They're actually in two groups. I'm going to group the Pfizer and the Moderna versions together, vaccines together. They did not become developed using a morally tainted, morally compromised cell line. That's not them. Nor is their manufacturing using such compromised cell lines. However, in some way or another, the testing was using cell lines of some sort. And I don't know to what degree that was. I have a hard time accessing that information. I wrote in the article in the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic that I had to write a little follow-up being like, oops, I didn't realize this. And part of that was we should note that they are involved with these lines through testing, which is, I think, fairly remote because it's not part of the integral reality of the vaccine, where it came from in the development or in its manufacturing. It was just kind of a one-time test just to make sure. I don't know, a one-time test. It was some type of testing that clarified that, okay, we can verify it in this way or another. But because it was much more of a touch-and-go kind of a thing, and not as part of the integrality of it, it is more distant from abortion, and it would be permitted. In fact, it would be an act of charity, the bishops say. So Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines, while they may have cooperation with evil, it is very, very distantly removed from that, and we are not going to do anything where we are willing that abortion. We will still voice our concerns, as I think the church has done so, but we may receive those vaccines with a peaceful conscience. The second group has only AstraZeneca in it, and there will be more vaccines who fall into this category. These should be avoided because they are much more integrally related with that cell line that is morally compromised because of its relationship, or rather because of its source in that cell line that came from an aborted fetus, that evil. That should be avoided. It should be avoided for us. Let me be clear here. It would be permitted normally. However, because of the opportunity that we provided, and because it is still fairly distant, but we have the opportunity for the vaccines in the first that are much better and are so much more distantly related to the evil acts of abortion. AstraZeneca is closer, but it's still distantly removed, and we would be able to accept that if we did not have access to the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. Those take precedence. In the absence of those, AstraZeneca would be approved. In the presence of Pfizer and Moderna's, we do not take those. In England, they only have AstraZeneca, perhaps, and so that would be legitimate. Or thinking of places where they can't transport the vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna because of extreme temperatures that are required to house them. Well, maybe AstraZeneca's would be a better option there. Would be the only option there currently. So when you cannot get the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine and you're choosing that in your freedom, great, you must do that. If that's an option, you got to do that. But if it's not an option, you may choose the AstraZeneca vaccine. To conclude for this part one, it is important for us to not be complacent. Yes, these vaccines may be legitimate, Pfizer and Moderna specifically. They might be very helpful, and there might be no moral qualms on our conscience to accept them. However, we need to be careful that we do not become complacent in cooperating with evil. If we have better options, we must pursue those better options. We can't become complacent. The recent elections have now put us into a situation where we will find ourselves with more temptations into deeper and more integral forms of cooperation with evil as Christians. And we need to be in the practice of being aware that we need to be wise, prudent, and discerning should there be any form of cooperation with evil. And then it needs to be unwillful cooperation as well as distant. We can't be integral cooperators with it and enablers. Even if we're like, oh, I don't personally believe in it. We cannot be enablers. We cannot be enablers. And we need to oppose evil, and we need to speak up. This is what I want to say. I want to awaken our determination to oppose evil at all levels and in every category. So brothers and sisters, this is what I conclude with today. This is our obligation. This is our duty. And may we do so with zeal, with fervency, and with great and profound trust in God. He has put us here in a very intentional way, each of us, into this cultural context and this time of history because he wants us here. He hasn't chosen Catherine of Siena to be here. He didn't choose St. Peter to be here. He chose you and me to be here. And we're going to have to be the next saints. So let's do it. May God bless you. Talk with you later. Bye.